It's official. McLaren has just released the first images of their 2026 car. And while the photos look clean, minimal, even elegant, what they suggest is anything but simple. This isn't just a new chassis. It's a warning shot. Because beneath those sharp lines and surgical packaging, McLaren may have just unveiled a concept so radical. Some in the paddock are already questioning if it's even within the spirit of the new rules. And it gets worse. According to insiders, what you see in these images is only half the story. The real innovation might be invisible. And it might already be working. For months, McLaren said nothing. No digital renders. No livery previews. No wind tunnel leaks, not even from their simulator vendors. In an off-season filled with carefully managed social media campaigns, they simply vanished. And now, just like that, they've dropped the first official images of the 2026 MCL40. But these aren't marketing photos. They're cold, clean, controlled. Studio lighting. Static angles. Zero flare. Just a machine, alone in frame. And the moment you look past the paint, you notice something strange. There's nothing aggressive here. No oversized barge boards. No overdeveloped winglets. No messy complexity. But that's what's so unsettling. Because in 2026, every car is supposed to look compromised. More efficient, yes. But also more constrained. The new regulations were meant to strip teams of overdesign. To limit aero dependence. To force packaging sacrifices due to stricter hybrid limitations. And yet, this McLaren doesn't look compromised. It looks balanced. Too balanced. The bodywork doesn't just fit. It seems integrated in a way most teams were expected to need months of trial and error to achieve. And if this level of packaging is already locked in, then the real story isn't what's shown in these images. It's what must have happened behind the scenes to make it possible. Because no one builds a car this refined by accident. Not in January. Not in this rule cycle. McLaren either saw something the others didn't, or started earlier than anyone realized. At first glance, the images look restrained. No oversized scoops. No dramatic floor edges. Nothing that screams innovation. But that's precisely what's so alarming. Because for insiders who understand how much the 2026 regulations were meant to constrain performance, the most dangerous car isn't the one that looks wild. It's the one that looks finished. And this McLaren looks finished. Take the side pods. According to technical advisors working with rival teams, the cooling aperture is narrower than expected. Too narrow, some say, at least for a car following traditional hybrid energy flow. Which implies one thing. McLaren isn't relying on cooling after energy is used. They're limiting the heat buildup before it starts. And the only way to do that, under the new regulations, is to anticipate where and when the energy demand will spike. And reshape the hybrid deployment to smooth those peaks out in real time. That means this isn't just about size. It's about strategy. The physical bodywork may reflect what the software already knows. And that's where the theory begins. Because if the body has been sculpted around predictive systems, rather than reactive cooling, then this car isn't managing temperature. It's avoiding it. The design doesn't show signs of stress relief. It shows intention, restraint, confidence that the internals won't need extra help to survive the demands of a race. Which leads to the unspoken conclusion some engineers are beginning to whisper. McLaren may have figured out how to run the car in thermal equilibrium, without sacrificing deployment and without venting excessive heat into the aerostream. And if that's true, this car isn't just efficient. It's self-regulating. Up to this point, everything can still be explained away as good engineering. Early preparation. Clean design philosophy. Strong integration with Mercedes. But this is where the story changes. Because once engineers began overlaying the leaked dimensions with the 2026 regulatory framework, a contradiction appeared. The car is too stable on paper. Not in terms of speed but in balance. The center of mass distribution implied by the images doesn't line up with what most teams are expecting from a car that's supposed to carry significantly more electrical energy, with a far more aggressive MGUK deployment curve. In simple terms, cars like this should look messier, more compromise, more visible cooling solutions, more aerodynamic concessions to protect the hybrid system. But the MCL40 doesn't show any of that. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if McLaren hasn't designed the car around the hybrid system, but instead designed the hybrid system to control the car? Because under the 2026 rules, active aerodynamics are allowed. The front and rear wings can change configuration between low drag and high downforce modes. What the rules don't clearly define is what data is allowed to trigger those changes. And that's where things start to feel dangerous. If McLaren has linked aero behavior not to driver input, but to internal energy state, battery load, deployment rate, thermal prediction. Then the car is no longer reacting to the circuit. It's reacting to itself. That creates a feedback loop the FIA may not have anticipated. A system where energy usage dictates drag. Drag dictates load. Load dictates deployment. All legal. All measurable. But collectively, unprecedented. And here's the key twist. This wouldn't show up in the images. It wouldn't even show up in a basic technical inspection. Because the advantage isn't in a wing or a floor. It's in how systems talk to each other. Which explains why McLaren was comfortable showing the outside of the car. Because the real innovation, the part that could change the competitive order, is invisible. And once a car like this hits the track, it's no longer just a performance question. It becomes a regulatory one. Behind the scenes, the real anxiety isn't about whether McLaren's car is fast. It's about what happens if it works exactly as intended. Because speed is measurable. It can be protested. It can be regulated. But what if the advantage lies somewhere else entirely? What if McLaren has built a car that lives in a space between systems, where legality is never directly broken, but where the structure of the rulebook simply doesn't reach? This is where the tone inside the paddock has shifted. Teams aren't accusing McLaren of cheating. Not yet. They're asking, what do they know that we don't? Because to build a car this composed, this integrated, requires more than just technical competence. It requires confidence in something no one else was prepared to exploit. And in Formula One, confidence at this level rarely comes from guesswork. It comes from prior knowledge. From running simulations on systems that haven't yet been declared legal or illegal. From reading the rulebook not for what it says, but for what it doesn't say. And McLaren has precedent. This kind of silence, this kind of calculated restraint, has echoes of Ferrari in 2019, Mercedes with DAS in 2020, Red Bull's flexing wings in the early hybrid era. None of those were technically illegal. Until they were. And that's what terrifies people now. Because if McLaren's advantage lives in the interaction between systems, cooling, aero, deployment, energy transfer, then banning it isn't as simple as writing a new clause. You'd have to define how much communication is allowed between independent components. You'd have to regulate how software interprets hardware conditions in real time. In short, you'd have to rewrite the philosophical core of the 2026 regulations. And that's not something the FIA can do mid-season, without detonating the competitive integrity of the sport. Which may be why McLaren hasn't said a word. No breakdowns. No technical briefings. No, here's what we learned in the wind tunnel videos. Just images. Clean, quiet, deliberate images. Because the longer they keep this car in silence, the harder it becomes to challenge what it's doing. And somewhere deep inside the FIA, that silence is getting louder. If this system works, if what's implied in these images is even half accurate, then McLaren hasn't just delivered a good car. They've changed the geometry of the championship. Because this kind of integration doesn't disappear over a weekend. It doesn't get nullified by a few tenths here or a weather swing there. It compounds. Let's start with Oscar Piastri. He's not just fast. He's unflappable. Emotionally neutral. Technically sharp. The kind of driver who doesn't need to feel the car fighting back in order to push it to the limit. He lets the system work. Which is exactly the profile you need for a car like this. If this car is doing what the paddock fears it might be doing. Because if the aero behavior, energy delivery, and temperature load are all self-balancing, then the driver's job becomes less about wrestling and more about sinking. And Piastri's strength? Is synchrony. He doesn't override the car. He listens to it. And that means without any headlines or drama. He could become the most quietly dangerous driver on the grid. Now consider the internal pressure this puts on Lando Norris. Still the reigning champion. Still the media face of McLaren. But if this car rewards mechanical empathy over instinct, and if Piastri is the one more in tune with its behavioral feedback, then suddenly the intra-team dynamic shifts. Not with arguments. Not with tension. But with data. And there is no debate in data. Elsewhere, the fallout could be even more severe. Ferrari? They followed a more conventional interpretation of the 2026 rulebook. Aero forward, high downforce, linear cooling. They're counting on extracting performance through refinement. But if McLaren is bypassing the need for raw cooling altogether, then Ferrari's efficiency race may already be over before it began. Red Bull? They face an even trickier problem. Their 2026 power unit is brand new, unproven, and not shared with any customer team. If McLaren already has a year's worth of thermal deployment data thanks to Mercedes, Red Bull could enter the season already blind on key integration variables. Even Mercedes might be outmaneuvered by their own customer. Because if McLaren pushed the integration model harder, asked for custom logic deeper in the software layer, and built their chassis around that interface from day one, then the works team might find themselves running a less complete version of their own engine. And here's the real danger. You can't copy this. You can replicate parts. You can adapt bodywork. You can try to mimic cooling philosophy. But you can't reverse engineer intent. Not without starting over. And in a 24-race calendar with limited testing, starting over is not a reset. It's a surrender. And now, we've seen it. The MCL40. Stripped of marketing hype. Released with surgical precision. Presented not to excite, but to control the narrative. Because what McLaren showed wasn't a spectacle. It was a message. This isn't about livery reveals or headline stats. It's about calm. About the kind of confidence that only comes when you already know something the rest of the grid hasn't figured out yet. They didn't need to scream. They didn't need to hint. They just showed the car. And walked away. Which is exactly what makes it terrifying. Because if the advantage is truly buried inside the logic of this machine, if this car is balancing its own systems, adjusting aero based on internal energy flow, and avoiding thermal stress before it starts, then the performance isn't just locked in. It's hidden. Hidden behind a wall of silence. Hidden in code the FIA hasn't reviewed yet. Hidden in behaviors that won't trigger any protest. Because nothing illegal is happening. Not yet. And the moment it hits the track, when this car begins to produce data in live conditions, the gap may no longer be theoretical. It may be visible. Visible in tire life. Visible in acceleration traces. Visible in how early this car can deploy energy compared to anyone else. And when that happens, regulations won't matter. Because by the time the FIA understands the system, it'll be too late to stop it without rewriting the rules mid-season. And that opens a political nightmare no one wants to trigger. So for now, the paddock watches. And waits. Not for a scandal. Not for a disqualification. But for the moment someone finally asks the question out loud. How long has McLaren been planning this? Because if they've known for over a year, if they've been quietly building around a blind spot no one else noticed, then this isn't a car reveal. It's a shift in the balance of power. And this may not even be the final version. Just the opening move in a much larger strategy. The images were clean. The message was quiet. But the warning was clear. McLaren is done catching up. And the rest of the grid may have just realized they're the ones falling behind.